My name's Jane Marks, and I'm the chair of the STM Association. And I just want to welcome you all to the Innovations Day. Thank you all for coming. Remind you that there are 2 more days of interesting meetings this week. There's a production seminar tomorrow and an open access seminar on Friday. So if you want more information, any of the staff here can tell you about that, and there's information on the website. So this is rapidly being dubbed now STM Week, and every year we seem to be getting more and more people here. So I'm delighted to see so many of you at today's meeting. I think it's a great agenda. So the first thing I need to do is to thank the committee who put this together. They're listed on the back of the page here, and thank you particularly to Jerry who led the effort here again for the Innovation Day. I'd also like to thank the sponsors, because without the sponsors we would have difficulty really running a day like this. And again, the sponsors are listed on the back. We have Aries, Atipon, Copyright Clearance Centre, Crossref, Hindawi, and Mark Logic. So thank you to them for sponsoring various parts of the day. Thank you very much for your help and support. And before I take any more time, I'd like to introduce Jerry Grenier and to introduce the IEEE lecture, which is the first lecture today, and our guest speaker. Jerry.
Well, thanks so much, Jane. It's, again, just a great privilege to be here today and to see so many familiar faces and a room that's pretty much to capacity, and just a testament that STM, indeed, as Jane alluded to, has taken over this first week in December from the meeting that was formerly known as London Online. So it's really a gratifying a moment for me to be up here today. It's my privilege this morning to introduce this year's IEEE keynote speaker, Michael Harris. Michael's the author of a recently published book, The End of Absence, Reclaiming what we've lost in a world of constant connection. Michael, just last week the book was just awarded the Canada Governor General's Award in Nonfiction, a quite prestigious award in Canada. And this week the book actually gets its formal launch in London. It's available in England. It's actually available this week in this part of the world. And I might say that we've had talks like this in the past where we introduce commentary on the consequences that this technology wrought upon us. And this book really is no exception. It's not a Luddite rant, but rather a sober view of the effects that technology have on us, both positive and negative. And I think there's no better way to sum up the précis of the book with a snippet from a review in Slate recently. And the writer of the review, a woman named Hannah Glazer, writes, "On a recent Saturday, I sent 112 text messages, refreshed my Facebook page 40 times, Instagram 15 times, Twitter 26 times. I checked my email 37 times. Before falling asleep, I set my phone to vibrate, plugged it into the outlet beside my bed. I then nuzzled up to my smartphone and drifted off to sleep, only to reach for my phone longingly in the morning." Michael Harris is concerned about where this relationship is going. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce Michael Harris. Thank you.
Thank you. Where should I put this? Maybe I'll put it right there. So thank you to STM for inviting me to come and speak with you today, and thanks also to the IEEE, that's how you say it, right, for sponsoring this talk. So the first few times I spoke at these things after my book was, after it came out, I got this kind of jolt of pleasure because people called me an author, which was a very nice thing to hear. But I wanted to tell you a story about what I was called 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I was working as an editor at a magazine in Vancouver, and one day all of us editors were corralled into what the publisher called a town hall. And there, in very cheerful tones, she informed us that we were no longer really editors. What we were was content creators. This is a depressing and stultifying phrase. If any of you are in a position to give people job titles, I wanted to take this opportunity to let you know what happens when you tell people, writers and editors, that they are now content creators. Everyone immediately takes a coffee break, which is actually a beer break, and they begin to talk about themselves as finding new jobs. When you call someone a content creator, you're saying that their value is just to fill the awful silences, or worse, that their job is to distract the masses long enough so that advertisers can sell them something. Just write something, just say something. We need more content. We abhor absence. And this is the dogma of the digital age. Silence, absence, solitude, certainly long-term attention are anathema to the leaders of the screen age. Later that afternoon, after I became a content creator, I found myself back at my desk in my little beige cubicle, staring at my 2 computer monitors. I had about a dozen windows open, and I was kind of pinging uselessly between them. And my state of digital distraction was actually really quite typical for me at the time. We all rationalize these interruptions that our phones and our tablets and our screens demand. Each checking of email or scanning of YouTube it's only just this momentary distraction. But consider for a moment how rapidly that usage has climbed. I think about teenagers usually when I think about these things, and at least a third of media exposure among teenagers is now involves multitasking. When this multitasking is accounted for, the media consumption rate among youths rises to a total of 10 hours and 45 minutes each day. 5 years ago, that number sat at 8 hours and 33 minutes. 5 years before that, it was 7 hours and 29 minutes. This is a very steep curve. In fact, I and most of us are part of this first generation of people who has more interactions with avatars than with flesh and blood people. We really do everything we can to fill in those moments of solitude. Anyway, back at my little cubicle at the magazine, I was swimming in distraction, but despite my new title of content creator, I was actually managing content more than I was creating it. I was refereeing Facebook pages. I was worrying whether our Twitter avatar was graphic enough. I had a dozen windows open on my screen, and I was bouncing around. Our technologies actually capitalize on something, I should say here, called an orienting response. This is why social media so easily distracts us. We're hardwired to reorient ourselves every time something snaps or flashes in our peripheral vision. The orienting response kept us alive in the wild because the thing that's snapping or flashing could be something that wants to eat you. But today, that same orienting response has been hijacked by our smartphones. And that day in my cubicle, it made sure that I looked down at my phone when my friend Tyler texted me. The message read, "Dude, are you alive or what?" Tyler was annoyed because he'd texted me 5 minutes earlier and I hadn't responded yet. But in my harried state, I read the message as something literal. Are you alive or what? And I looked up at the glowing rectangles that I spent most of my life staring at, and I thought, no, this isn't the life that I actually intended for myself. So I quit my job, and I began working on my book, On the End of Absence, in order to try and describe what this strange new world of unbridled, unthinking content creation, this world of constant connection that we find ourselves in actually is. It was important to me to think about this now, I figured, because ours is the only generation in history that actually knows what life is like before and after the advent of the internet. This is a really rare and I think kind of fascinating position to be in. We're actually very lucky because we're experiencing life on two sides of a Gutenberg scale shift. If you were born after 1985, you've only experienced an adult life in the age of screens. If you were born before 1985, you're a digital immigrant, and that means you're carrying around in your heads the last versions of certain memories, memories of absence, of solitude, that are going to be extinct in a few years. What then is the value of that idea of absence? I think the answer is actually very simple. It's in moments of absence, moments of solitude, that we develop a rich interior life. Removed from the groupthink of online life, we're able to choose for ourselves what we like, what we believe, what we stand for. I'm going to elaborate on that value of absence later on, though. First, I should point something out. If we believe that absence has an intrinsic value, then it may be up to us, digital immigrants, to safeguard things like solitude and reverie for future generations. And how can we do this? First, there's small personal ways. For example, I took an analog August last year, which meant no internet, no cell phones for a month. And I kept a diary while I did it, so I thought I would read to you a little bit from this time that I went Walden. So these are just a few diary entries. I apologize for the kind of casualness of their tone. August 1. Every morning, Kenny, that's my partner, he's the guy who drew that cartoon, actually, which is me trying to read War and Peace while my iPhone stalks me. Every morning, Kenny and I eat our cereal next to each other at the long wooden table, each facing our respective laptops. It's nice. We look at our blogs and collect necessary narratives for dispersal throughout the day with other happy, informed citizens. I'll call Kenny over to check out a trailer for the new Hunger Games. He'll pull me over to catch an Anderson Cooper clip. We dip our heads in the ocean together. This morning, Kenny went to his usual post, and I sat at the kitchen table alone with my Raisin Bran. I blinked at the empty chair across from me. In the next room, a YouTube video played on repeat. Kenny's cracking up. Torture. Feels like I just stepped off an incredibly fast ride, and the sheer slowness of everything is freaking me out. Every 5 minutes, my brain asks me to look up an image that it's lacking. What does Kate's baby look like again? How many references to robots are there in Alan Turing's papers? It feels insane not to be allowed to know. I have to let questions constantly slide by. Hello, 1987. August 6. The instinct to check email comes naturally to me each morning, insistent as the urge to shower, to put on the kettle. I feel unawake without it, wrapped in some cotton batting. Simultaneously, I feel like a child who ran away and then was crushed to discover nobody noticed his disappearance. August 8, I dream of email. All night I crafted perfect missives to Barack Obama and Kirsten Dunst. Alas. August 11, decided I'm excited about my sabbatical, as this extreme disconnection will surely lead to a profound epiphany. August 14, no epiphany yet. It is hard still, though not physically sick-making anymore. Meanwhile, I spent 2 hours today looking up things in books I could have sourced online in 30 seconds. Perhaps the hedonism comes later. August 23, my tolerance toward interruption has plummeted. During a chat at the pub or on the seawall, my companion will raise a finger, pressing an invisible hold button in the air between us, and answer an incoming text message with a sort of blithe assumption that my own attention will immediately flit somewhere else in the meanwhile. But without my phone on hand, I simply stare into this white noise and wait. The real annoyance, though, is not with the conversation pauses. It's with conversations that grow dull as a result. 80% of someone's attention elicits 10% of my interests. A divided self is simply not worthwhile to look at. So then I disengage, I'll start daydreaming, or I'll study a mosquito bite, and we end up with a case of compound distraction. August 24th, this is the last one, I promise. Was at first distraught to find that everyone I informed about Analog August wanted to know what my epiphany had been. Surely, if I was going to all this trouble, I must be experiencing an inner transformation. Or perhaps my interrogators felt the exercise was pointless, but assumed I would claim such a transformation to save face. I found myself a little desperate to make something up. The closest thing I can report, though, won't sound dramatic enough. It's just this, that behavior which seemed utterly normal on the 30th of July now looks to me like unnecessary social grooming. Now, when I see teenage girls burrowed into their phones on the sidewalk, I think of monkeys picking lice out of their hair. Anyway, you get the point. So there are little ways like that in Analog August, ways for us to reboot our brains. And this might be the best way to remember that every technological reality is a lens that we shutter over our eyes, and every lens is a tinted lens. Remember that the Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz isn't actually emerald. In the Hollywood film version, it is. Judy Garland and her gang kind of traipse through this sparkling green town. But in L. Frank Baum's original book, Dorothy and the others are exhorted to put on safety goggles that they later discover are tinted green. The goggles are a way to give ourselves over to an authority that wishes for you to see things in a particular light. And we are wearing goggles each time we Google. But the hope is that we can take them off now and then, so as to remember we're wearing them at all. Only through a digital detox like that, I think, do we shake ourselves awake to the fact that our online lives do drastically alter our perceptions of the world and of ourselves. But there are also broader systemic things that we can do. It doesn't have to be just individual, it can be managerial. For example, you guys probably all heard about this, but in early April, a series of reports appeared online lamenting the lazy French. Canadian American workers have this idea that Parisians are always goofing off while they're doing the real work. In April, we had proof. A new French labor law had apparently arrived, which banned employers from emailing their employees after 6 p.m. But in fact, this turned out to be more a case of lazy journalism than lazy French. The law was a hyperbolic myth. It was a labor agreement, not a law at all, aimed at improving health among a specific group of professional employees. And there wasn't even that hard 6 p.m. email curfew. However, like all myths, this one revealed a set of abiding values subscribed to by the folk who perpetuated the myth itself. So a Gallup poll released in May found most American workers believe their permanent digital connection with other workmates is actually a positive. There's no such thing as free time in an online economy, and we profess to be happier for it. We've engineered for ourselves a kind of cult of connectivity and a culture of ambient work. However, in a world where 6,000 tweets are sent every second, a world where 100 hours of YouTube video are uploaded for every minute that we actually manage to live, we need to be wary of mistaking communication for getting things done. Might disconnection actually be a smart business practice too? Is there a fallacy inherent in a work life that employs, as Linda Stone called it, continuous partial attention? Perhaps this ambient work we're doing would be better termed diluted work. After all, a culture in which we're free to work anywhere, anytime, can rapidly devolve into one where permanent and ambient workloads are de rigueur. Half of us now check our email while still in bed, for example. And this doesn't lead inevitably to greater productivity. When we respond to coworkers on the metro or in lineups at the grocery store, we may believe that we're being these splendid, tireless workers, but attached to this approach is the notion of ambient playtime, too, inevitably. And I think we often forget that part of it. Social media titans like Facebook and Twitter are always telling us that it's actually during office hours that their sites are most active. So the worker who's required to respond to her boss on Sunday afternoon will think nothing of responding to her friends on Wednesday afternoon. Naturally, these digital derailments at work require an enormous investment of attention and cognitive energy. The time lost cruising Facebook is not the only time lost, though. There are several minutes wasted as the worker re-enters the original task. Constant shifts of focus create cumulative attention debt. Being always at work, then, becomes the same thing as being never at work. And we should consider whether this indulgence in ambient connectivity produces an enormous waste of time and money. The fallacy underlying all this is the notion that being busy equals being effective. We abhor single-stream attention. And the culture of ambient work boils down to a belief in the value of multitasking. I spoke with Dr. Douglas Gentile, a professor of Iowa State University, who specializes in the effects of media on attention span. And he told me that everyone who thinks they're good at multitasking is wrong. Quote, "We know that, in fact, it's those who think they're good at multitasking who are the least productive when they multitask." The brain itself is not, whatever we may like to think, a multitasking device. The very word multitask is actually a misnomer. When we think we're multitasking, we're just multi-switching. We think we're being productive, but in reality, we're giving ourselves extra work. So those who are at work while making breakfast for the kids may be helping no one. Each switch of attention sets their brain back, resulting in a permanently harried workforce and one incapable of delivering concentrated bursts of real, sustained creative energy. Employers looking for brave new ideas or significant critical thinking must consider that disconnection is sometimes preferable to connection. I mean, this is sort of akin to, you don't ask someone who just jogged for 4 hours to then run a sprint, right? Ambient workloads may not be heavy or significant workloads. Therefore, we ought to shape optimal connectivity levels for various strata of our organizations, I think. Some parts of the workforce do need to be more constantly connected, but other levels, those expected to produce paradigm shifts, those expected to have real creative results, will need to be identified, and then proper breaks from the digital maelstrom need to be engineered for them. For their part, those employees may need to make a humbling kind of psychological adjustment, which is, the world doesn't need me so badly that it can't get along for 3 hours without a response. I can batch process my email just 5 times a day, and nothing's going to actually fall apart. The great historian of technology, Melvin Kranzberg, said, "Technology is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral." That statement should, I think, become a real tenet of the screen age. The point is never abstinence or binging. It's this actively selecting levels of tech engagement that maximize our productivity, our success, and our happiness. As assumed ambient work culture is inherently passive. There's no choosing, there's only reacting to the ping, ping, ping from the iPhone. But we can be, I think, much more active, more creative in the way that we design our lives. So the French didn't actually ban email after 6 p.m., but maybe they should have. And perhaps we ought to ask ourselves why we had such a violent reaction to the idea in the first place. I think I should pause here just to underline that this question about absence, about whether or not we still value solitude, is not actually directed at any one group, not the Americans or the French or South Koreans, who, by the way, have a 99% saturation rate for cell phones now, which I thought was kind of amazing. And it's not directed at Luddites, and it's not directed at millennials. There's been some confusion about who I wrote the book for. And I'm largely to blame for this, because I didn't really think about that during the 2 years that I wrote the thing. My writing, no matter how researched, though, it was always drawing constantly on my personal interests, on my personal history and my personal state of mind. The personal is political, I think. And writing this book drove home for me that it's actually very public also. So I figured I'd write what I wanted to read, and I hoped it would speak to more than just my small circle of friends. And yet, roughly, I've done about 100 interviews now about this book, and the confusion about its intended audience appears to be quite a stubborn one. The first reviews came from digital natives who, while mostly kind, read my book as a critique of their own tech-happy lives. This surprised me a little, because I wasn't really writing at them, but about many people in my life, which included toddlers and teenagers and octogenarians. But still, these digital natives took it personally and felt it had been directed toward them. From one campus where the end of absence became part of the reading curriculum for media studies program, I got a photo on Twitter, which was of these two girls under a blanket reading the book, and the message was, "We're not as insipid as you think we are." Which I was just happy that they used the word insipid. But I don't actually think their generation is inherently shallow. I just think that they're in danger of growing up with less solitude and less absence. And I thought about quibbling with them about this over Twitter, but it seemed to kind of miss the point, so I didn't. And then there were these radio interviews, and the accents changed from San Fran to Montreal to London, but their ages didn't. It seems like all radio hosts are baby boomers, basically. And they were telling me these stories about their children's addictions to devices and their own addictions to devices. And if digital natives had made me feel like an old man, then radio hosts made me feel like this naive youngster. Some of them talked about firsthand experiences of the introduction of the television, actually, which was a bit bizarre. The young had felt I'd written a book that would teach them about themselves, and the middle-aged felt I'd written a book that would explain the New World Order to my elders. Of course, neither demographic had it quite right. I had neither the inclination nor the wherewithal to moan about the old days, and I often felt as bewildered about the new days as anyone. I sort of straddle before and after, like probably most of the people in this room. My book was for both sides of that Gutenberg moment. People don't like indeterminacy, though. It seems to kind of like itch their brains, I think. If you've written a book about online life, there are these two camps that you can fall into. You're either this starry-eyed tech evangelist, or you're a finger-wagging Luddite. They definitely thought I was more the Luddite than the evangelist. But my hope is that the book, and a lot of others that are being published this year, can now occupy this more permissive space in between those two positions. I think it's kind of time to get over the newness of the future. We just sort of live here now, right, all of us. Internet.org and other initiatives, through this powerful amalgam of philosophical and capitalist initiatives, are soon going to bring online the 4.4 billion people who still don't have access to the kind of internet that we have. And then this contest between digital natives and digital immigrants is going to get old really fast, I think, at that point. My partner Kenny and I recently visited Toronto's Alan Lambert Galleria to see the winning photographs from the World Press competition. We saw these survivors of typhoons and rebels attacking government checkpoints, and much of it was just gritty and beautiful, but sort of expected. And then there was this image by the American photographer John Stanmeier that caught me, that made me think more about this idea of how we are all in this world now, and it's not this competition between. It was a photo of a small crowd of African migrants standing on a moonlit shoreline east of Ethiopia. And they're holding their phones aloft, attempting to catch an affordable signal from Somalia across the water. And the blue glow of their phones is echoing this big, ethereal glow from the moon. They're attempting to reach their relatives who are midway through a journey toward this presumed better life in the Middle East or in Europe. And they seem, with those hands, those phones stretched out, to form this kind of sublime expression of a global desire for connection, which our digital devices do facilitate. We're all kind of standing on the shore, I think, holding our phones up. We're all hoping on an almost religious level to make that greater connection, whatever that might mean for each of us. For all the problems that our devices create, there's also there's something noble, I think, to the effort itself. And that's why I think we're done with books of tech evangelism and books of paranoid worry, because the revolution is basically complete. So now the real discussion that we need to have is, how do we live in this new world? And it's, as I said, a conversation for everybody. It's just not interesting, I don't think, to chatter at the young or like to wink at the elderly anymore. So now when people, if they do ask me who I wrote the book for, whoever it is, I just say, oh, I wrote it for you. And luckily, people don't really have a response to that. And I wanted to, I think, finish by explaining a little bit more about that global shift. And I think I'll do that by telling you a story about a young woman that I met. Her name's Linda Jimmy. Linda is someone I spoke to really early on while I was working on this book. And the story she told sort of became this powerful example for me of the ways that absence has been disappearing from our lives, all of our lives, and what we lose in the bargain. So anyway, here's her story, and then I'll be done. Back in the dark ages of 1996, Linda was living in a Malaysian settlement called Batu Lima, which sat deep in that country's tropical forests, 5 kilometers from the closest village. The settlement's one-room houses were largely abandoned or dismantled by then. And the buildings, it takes place in 1996, I said that, right, sorry. The buildings that remained stood on stilts with floors of bamboo. In fact, only one family was left. Among the 12 children, one daughter, called Linda Jimmy, was 14 years old and ready to leave. There was a box with 4 little legs in their house, and in the box, a black and white television. There was no electricity. Linda was tasked with gathering firewood for the kitchen stove each day. But on special occasions, Linda's father would take the car battery that powered the TV into the village and have it charged. Then Linda could watch Sesame Street, which was senseless but wonderful, with its American children and Muppets prattling in confounding English and playing out their deeply foreign antics. Big Bird was yellow, Linda learned. The village children had electricity and color televisions. They would brag about their colors. Linda said, "I know," and told the other children that her family had colors too. Sesame Street was baffling, but Linda's family believed intrinsically in spirits and ghosts, so the apparitions that flashed on the television screen could be folded into a larger trust in magic and brushes with the unknowable. And besides, more magical by far was the kamburunga that Linda's grandmother, Sukat, wielded. Linda never touched the sacred object herself for fear of angering the spirits and growing sick, but she could look across the hut at the thing in her grandmother's hands, a tight bundle of teeth taken from several animals and knotted together with a small collection of bones. Sukat, who could handle the kamburunga with impunity, had access to a spirit whom she could call upon for help when attempting to heal members of the Dusun tribe. Once, before the village was abandoned, Linda watched her grandmother work her magic over a child who'd been stricken with fever. Sukat moved her kamburunga over the sickly child's head, shaking her bundle of teeth for 5 full minutes while the infant sweated beneath. Sukat told the spirit to undo this child's illness, and the spirit asked for a sacrifice, a chicken or a couple cups of rice. Sukat's healing powers were meant to be passed on to her daughter, Linda's mother, But Sukat died too early, and then, like many Malaysians, Linda's mother converted to Catholicism. When the family finally left Batu Lima and moved to town, Linda's mother left behind Sukat's mystical equipment. Linda, too, was taking steps away from that miniature settlement, away from the mythical past of Malaysia. She wanted something more, though she couldn't say what more might look like. At 18, she ran away from home and moved to the city of Sabah, a relative metropolis with its 2,000 people. There she worked at a KFC restaurant. She saved her meager wages for months before purchasing a mobile phone, which became precious to her. She wanted badly to enter the modern world, to live at last in the full glow of the world's future. Eventually, Linda worked her way up to the far classier Little Italy restaurant in Kota Kinabalu. The pay was the same, but at least tourists dined there, which meant Linda could practice her English. Tourists like Nate, a Canadian who just graduated from university and was backpacking around the region. "Come hang out in Singapore with me," he offered. "Sure," said Linda, and she went a little further afield. The couple had their affair, and Nate left for home, promising to return in the fall. Linda hoped, rather than believed, that the promise would be fulfilled. And when Nate did return, eventually inviting Linda to come live on the other side of the world, in Vancouver, she may well have undergone severe culture shock. The Canadian city was almost a letdown, though, since Linda had assumed that every city in North America looked like New York, the city she'd seen in black and white on Sesame Street. A few years and many miles later, in 2006, Linda returned. Now she was a soon-to-be Canadian, toting a laptop to her mother's hut. She patched into the internet through a shaky dial-up connection and managed to introduce her mother to the wonder that is Google. "This can show you everything," she told her mother. Videos of celebrities flashed across the laptop screen. "Here, I'll show you where I live in Canada." A few taps later, the laptop screen was displaying a map of the world, and Linda proceeded to zoom into Canada, into British Columbia, into Vancouver, into the city's east side, and finally into the block where she lived with Nate. "There," she said to her mother, pointing. "That's where I live. That's my home." Her mother didn't understand at first, and Linda continued to wave at the screen. "This can show you everything." "It can show me everything," her mother asked, now leaning in, full of wonder. "Everything. What do you want to see?" The answer came through tears. "Show me my mother in the afterlife." Thank you.
Some questions. Thank you, Michael. That was great. I think we have some time for questions, and I see Joe, and maybe just Joe with the microphone. So, and also Richard. So, please.
Hi, David. I'm William Gunn. I'm with Mendeley, and I think I have a unique perspective, kind of on the story that you told. Having grown up in a very rural area in 1975, and now working, and almost always having worked as a remote employee for most of my professional life, in a role that keeps me very connected. And requires that I, be visible, and so I do agree with a lot of what you said about the need for distractions and distinguishing between the things that are urgent and attention getting versus the things that are really important that we need to focus on. But what I don't necessarily see is how these online devices are anything different than the distractions that we had before they came about, which was, meetings, conversations, journal entries, daydreams, et cetera. And is there a fundamental difference between these connected devices and the distractions of the past?
Right. Well, what I wasn't able to talk about in the book was the larger historical perspective. The book really looks at the history of technology from the 15th century onward. And I think absolutely there is that history there, but that it's the quantitative difference which eventually becomes a qualitative difference, just by the sheer massing of it. I mean, the Gutenberg Revolution, which is maybe the closest equivalent that we have, Gutenberg invents the printing press in 1450, but it's really not until the 19th century that literacy is very common throughout Europe. So it's actually centuries for that to take place. And I think the massive difference, the uniqueness of what we're going through, is that we're going through this Gutenberg scale shift in a single generation. And that we do have these people who are living before and after, and that straddle generation. So you're right, it is more of the same, but it's just so much more of the same.
Well, just one more brief comment. Of course, I have to say that some of this, we were having this a discussion on Twitter as we were listening to your talk, some of us here in this room, and people who weren't in this room, And the question came up whether or not your book is or will be available as an ebook.
It is available as an ebook.
Okay.
I think we have Anthony.
Anthony Watkinson's cyber research at University College London. It's a statement as well as a question. I was in publishing for 40 years, and I was pretty good at it, but I found my life was a reactive one. And the people who really did really well, I can think of people who everybody would know here, like Richard Charkin, for example, are people who did make time to think. I didn't make time to think. It makes me a bad researcher, and I never finished my dissertation, for example. Okay? But I think there are two different, you can have different types of people. Do you think there are different types of people who are in the big mix of things, who do different types of jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on that briefly, that I think what we need is not a single prescription for how to interact, but that we need to be actively engineering various levels of engagement with technology, depending on the kind of job. So for someone, for example, who's writing a novel, you're not going to do, I don't think, a particularly good job if you are checking your Twitter every 5 minutes. But if you are the personal aide to the Prime Minister, perhaps sleeping with your BlackBerry is actually imperative. Yeah. So it's not being passive about the engagement, but actively choosing the level of engagement.
Okay.
Kent Anderson, AAAS Science. And do you talk in your book at all about some of the other things that have ended because of this or seem to be ending? I've noticed people don't like telephones ringing and not knowing who it is, or even checking and seeing who it is and ignoring the phone. Mm-hmm. People will sit in the same room and not talk to each other but text each other. Mm-hmm. So conversation or serendipity or surprise seems to be less tolerated. Did you talk at all about that?
Yeah, a little. I mean, I try not to make fun of tech-happy teenagers too much, but like that point about changing behavior around how do we communicate, and how comfortable are we with other human beings is definitely talked about in the book. Who is it? Sherry Turkle at MIT wrote a fantastic book called Alone Together, where if you're interested in that kind of behavioral change, in addition to reading my book, I would say you should read hers for sure. She's actually extremely smart. You should probably read her book first. But she talks about how terrified young people are of voice-to-voice conversations on the phone. I think anybody who has a teenager in their life now knows that phones aren't for talking anymore. Yeah.
Question?
On that last comment, I'm part of the generation that remembers not having phones and stuff like that.
Not having
but can I
phones.
just defend the era of some damn bugger ringing you up and interfering with what you're doing?
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoy the handshaking protocol of people checking whether they can talk to you, or you being able to manage a conversation in your own time. Actually, I find they're much more freeing to have that kind of continual discussion, interaction on Skype or the phone, than being interrupted continually by phone calls.
Yeah.
And then having to engage in a much longer conversation. So, it's not all bad.
No, I agree.
But I do feel as if you do kind of make a black and white view. Mm-hmm. And I think that is probably, for me, that's not so positive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would agree that, when call display was invented, it was a godsend. Just because, I do tend to be the critical one. The fallout of those things sometimes, though, is, I now know that if it's too late for them to call, or they won't pick up the phone, we create a kind of casualness around making the communicative reach out in the first place. So I sometimes wonder if you have call display, or if you have text messages, the general swarm of communication that comes at you, even though you have more and more control, ostensibly, that swarm is still larger in net. But that said, I think you're absolutely right that we can be smart about these things, and that we can use different aspects of communication technology to to engineer it. Like, that's what you're talking about, really, is engineering your own experience of it. And I think, rather than say that the smartphone is a force for evil in the world, I would just say, I think up till now we've been very naive, generally. A lot of us have been very naive and lazy about our interaction with it. It's that thing where the technology is shaped by us, and then it shapes us. And I just think we have to be more active and creative in the way that we interact with them.
I'm David Thomas with Thomson Reuters. In today's age, when young people, I'm talking about young people, are in a learning process, brains are developing, they're in school, education, and they're constantly online, they're constantly being distracted, there's always things happening around them. Has there been any studies that you know have been done? Has the constant interruption, or the ability to concentrate on one task at a time and really learn and retain, has it been affected by the new habit of doing things, all these things happening simultaneously? You start doing one thing, the texts come in, you look at it, then somebody else happens something. It's like this constant interruption that's happening. Is it affecting any brain development, the ability to learn, the ability to concentrate and retain? Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, the neuroscience is there in the book a little bit. Nicholas Carr wrote a fantastic book called The Shallows. I feel like I'm telling everyone to read other books, but if you're interested in the neuroscience, Nicholas Carr's book is fantastic. It was shortlisted for the Pulitzer. I can tell you the American Academy of Pediatrics has reinstated their rule that children under 2 years should have no screen time at all, and that children over 2 years should have 2 hours of recreational screen time as a maximum, which of course nobody meets that standard. But the AAP has said that levels of attention deficit disorder appear to go up, and they seem to be making a causal argument for that.
Evke Smit, STM. You said that your book is really about how to live the online life in this new world. When I read your book, I was also intrigued not just by what happened in that month of absence, but also when you logged on again. And I remember you had some text there about binge behavior.
Yeah,
so you sort of dive deep in again.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, if your book is about how to live this online life, has your online life now become better? And in what way do you do that, or what has changed?
Right. Well, I should point out, I wrote the book not because I think I'm better at living online than others, but probably because I think I'm worse at it. I'm attracted to topics that are difficult for me, so that was why I wrote the book. And I don't, as much as anybody else, I love being connected. And when I took that month off, and when I came back online, yes, I went from being the best boyfriend in the world, who was like this golden Labrador who would pay attention to you any time you came home because I was so starved for connection, to being the worst boyfriend in the world because I was giving clipped answers and just obsessing about the 400 emails that had stacked up in my inbox in the meantime. And I think ultimately I didn't. You can't change your brain in a month, right? Neuroplasticity doesn't work that simply, I don't think. In the end, it has to be this daily ritual of being cognizant of what kind of connections you're making and when you're making them. But just as you always need sugars and fats, and every day you have to make a decision about whether or not you need the chocolate cake, I think you're always going to need connections, right? So it's about a media diet that you're crafting for yourself, and never about abstinence, I don't think.
Hi. I play a game with my friends at dinner parties called Smartphone Bingo. And everyone puts their smartphone in the middle of the table, and whoever touches it first gets to pay for the meal.
I've heard people doing this, yeah.
I'm interested that actually improves the meal for everyone, I think. So any thoughts around kind of ways of either gaming or rules that can improve interaction, or structures that can help us manage this?
Right. Well, that's one of the best ones I've heard of. I think anytime there's punishment and shame, it helps a lot, right? What else? I know a lot of people have instituted a kind of secular Sabbath, where on the Sundays their family doesn't use smartphones, or the child's phone is taken away and put on the top of the fridge. For children, I think that really the best thing we can do is actually be an example. We sometimes think they don't need to text, but I need to text at the dinner table because I'm a grown-up and I can do whatever I want. So there are those little engineered moments, right, that we can do. Also, if you write a book called The End of Absence, then it's very good for this sort of thing, because now everybody's looking at you, and I'm very aware of now being like the guy who wrote the I Hate Technology book, and so I can never take out my phone in public anymore. So that will work too if you have the time.
Heather Flanagan. I work at the RFC series, but when I'm not working with that, I work with the Internet Identity and Privacy crowd. And I think what you've been writing here is a very interesting complement to that body of work as we try and figure out how technology and privacy and actual identity on the internet are supposed to function, because there's such a gap between if you have three hands, on the one hand, what policy allows, on the other hand, what technology allows, and on that third hand, what people seem to expect, which just varies so wildly.
Yeah. There's a glossary of definitions that I made up at the back of the book, and one of them, oh gosh, I'm going to forget what the actual term was. But anyway, it was this idea of condition creep, right? That with each generation, we click on the "Do you accept the terms and conditions" button more and more readily. I remember seeing those things for the first time and thinking I had to read the terms and conditions. And I think it's very telling that we've arrived at it very quickly at a state where nobody would ever think of reading the legally binding contract that they're clicking "I accept." And I think that aside from reading the terms and conditions, which nobody can really do, the most helpful thing we can do for online safety and for privacy concerns would be something that would be very difficult, which would be bringing into school curriculums critical studies in media. It seems that whenever I see a media studies class in high school or in elementary school, what it actually means is we're going to teach you how to make a movie on iMovie or something. But what I want to see is, just as we're teaching people to critically read Jane Austen, I want people to be able to critically read an Instagram feed or critically read Snapchat and know that, you know, Snapchat says that the picture disappears, but in fact, we now know that the picture does not disappear. Children are very good at using technology, but they're not very good at seeing themselves use technology. And I think it's beholden upon us to help them become much less naive about those things. So I would love to see critical studies in technology become part of national curriculum.
Well, that just about brings us to the 10:30 break. Well, I guess one more question. We'll take one more. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I think that this actually triggers a lot of things in our brains because this is like a timely subject. But my question, first one comment, I think one of the things about digital detox that you talked about, that concept seems like a new age diet fad. Yeah. Like it's like, of course, everything in moderation is what we have to do. Mm-hmm. And somehow we have a habit of getting into that, what's the latest problem and what's the new solution to that. Yeah. Yeah. But that was my comment. But my question is, I think your title of the book is named The End of Absence. To me, all this distraction actually seems like the end of presence. So I just wanted your thoughts on that. Like, yeah. You know, it's somehow we are not present when we are looking at our computer screens, when we're sitting on a dinner table. So mm-hmm. I just wanted to find out, why did you say the end of absence?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, because it's a very good point. I, while writing this, had many conversations with people about whether or not it was the end of absence or the beginning of absence. And the book could almost have been called either or. In the end, we went with this because the word absence for me is a sort of catch-all term for solitude and daydreaming and reverie. And those, which could also be called presence, right, are the things that I feel have been sort of elbowed out of our lives. But you're right. Linguistically, it's a difficult title.
Well, let me ask one more question, or just a comment, I guess, and that's, as you were speaking, Michael, I wrote a question down that said, do you have a prescription for how we proceed? And then during the question and answer period, the analogy of food came up to my head. And think of the ways that, you know, the food industry in the middle of the 20th century really began to pump sugar, salt, and fat into our food. And it wasn't until late in the 20th century we began to see actually municipal laws. I'm from the New York City area, we all know that past Mayor Bloomberg tried to ban the 32-ounce Coca-Colas, and we also saw, more nutrition information on the packaging in the late 20th century. So, do you see do you see government or corporations playing a role? You mentioned the American Academy of Pediatrics perhaps playing a role. Do you think that society will begin to recognize this as a problem and begin to not take liberties away from folks, but just begin a program of education? So what this is might be doing to us.
I think the corollary with the food diet is actually a very important one. We evolved in a space where sugars and fats were very rare. And so we grew it was important for that animal that we were to crave sugars and fats and take them whenever we could. And now we live in a world where certain corporations have hijacked that desire that is built into us on a very carnal level. Similarly, we grew up in a world where being connected to other humans was of vital importance for our survival. And so that desire for connection is built into our genome. And now we have corporations that have hijacked that desire to a certain level. That does not mean that Google and Facebook are evil, I don't think that. But the technologies themselves are designed to trigger things that are elemental to who we are. And so, yes, I think in the same way that we have food diets to manage the way that we consume those things. And I don't know whether it has to be government or not for technology, but we do seem to require some level of management or control. But that would be another book.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Michael, again. And now it's time for us to avail ourselves of some of the sugar, salt, and fat at the bar in the back. And we'll meet back here at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much, and thank you, Michael, again.